Hey everyone, happy October, happy Halloween. It is psychic medium Josh Simons coming to everyone with a story. And this is a story that I want everybody to hear and see themselves in the middle of. My story as a psychic, as a medium, is different than pretty much every other person out there that does this professionally. Everybody else that I have found, everybody that does this professionally has this story, whether that story is accurate or not, about how they have been talking to spirits since they were about 5. Anybody that you see as a professional psychic medium pretty much has this story of, well, being a spirit speaker since the age of 5, since this, talking to spirits, working with spirits since the age of 5. There's a whole lot to call into question there with those sorts of statements, whether they're accurate or not, and I'm not here to downplay anybody else's experiences or stories. I do want to point out how my story is a little bit different and how you can benefit from this. As a child, I would never say that I was talking to spirits. Not going to claim that, don't have the evidence, and don't really even feel like it's a claim to fame. I can say that since I was a very young child, about 3 years old, I loved scary stuff. I loved the occult, I loved spirits, I loved vampires and werewolves and ghosts and zombies and horror movies. And I was like the 7 or 8 year old kid that was reading Stephen King. I loved scary things. And we can see how in my life that those kind of spooky things have come out to play in my life. All right. Just recently have I been thinking of the spooky stuff. I'm watching a show right now on Netflix called The Midnight Club, and it's by a guy, directed by a guy named Mike Flanagan, and he's done some really good work. He's put out a show called Midnight Mass that was excellent. He did the movie of Dr. Sleep, a Stephen King movie, the sequel to The Shining, that was really good. And I'm watching this show, and it's about these terminally ill kids who have sort of like a promise with each other that if one of them passes away from the other side, they'll do everything that they can to make sure that their presence is known, that we'll get proof that there's a hereafter or an afterlife. And I'm watching this and I'm sitting with it and I'm like, wow, you guys need a medium. You guys need a medium. You need somebody who's speaking to the other side to show you that evidence. And that's an important word that goes with mediumship is evidential. You know, somebody who claims to be a medium should be able to tell you and show you things about spirits, about stuff going on in your life that there's no way for them to know. It should be clear and present evidence. Now, this show, I'm sitting with it and I'm like, wow, okay, so a guy like me who knows that spirits are out there, who knows that the dead exist and they interact and overlap with our lives, what's spooky for me? I've done this professionally coming up on 5 years now, and I have established that the world of the dead and the world of spirit very much interact with our own. It's kind of like a fact of life for me. It's like an everyday sort of thing, which is difficult for people to sit with me because it might not be a everyday thing for them. So I'm sitting here watching this show and I'm like, wow, what's scary? And I've sat with the things that are scary to me, really scary to me. And it's not the dead and it's not spirits. It might be the people and the situations outside of me. I think, for me, and I think a lot of folks can relate to this, the scariest monsters that we have to contend with in our life are the ones within ourselves. They are. They're the fears, the worries, the depressions, the anxieties, the addictions, all of these awful things that can sit within us. Here's how horror movies have saved my life. I am a big fan of Freddy Krueger. Freddy Krueger, Nightmare on Elm Street, guy with the knife fingers, he was in the dreams and everything. And I sit with it. I'm like, why is that story appealing? I used to love Freddy. He was like a smart ass. He was like wisecracking and shit. You know, it was just a fun sort of set of horror movies. And yeah, one of the reasons why I really, really appreciate horror movies and the stories that they tell us is something that we find more in the modern horror movies, and this is something that's kind of been with us since the 70s, the idea of the final girl. Now, some people, I wouldn't expect many people to be watching horror movies because they are for a certain set of folks. The idea of the heroine or the hero of the story, the final girl, this is something that we can see in a lot of different movies, right? Especially horror movies, and I'll give you some examples. We have Nancy from A Nightmare on Elm Street. We have Ripley from the Alien movies. We have Sidney Prescott from the Scream movies. We have Laurie Strode from the Halloween movies. There are these characters in these movies that provide you with that sort of vantage point. We're watching the movie and the story unfold from this person's perspective, but they are the hero. And Nancy from A Nightmare on Elm Street, she watches all of her friends around her pass away. She watches this awful dream demon doing his thing. And yet at the very end, it's her who beat him. She beat him. I'm fascinated by this because we as children in this world, and it's changing now, but for people of my generation, older, maybe even a little bit younger, we get raised with like Cinderella and Snow White and Little Red Riding Hood. And really any of these characters that are female, you know, if you think of Little Red Riding Hood, it was the lumberjack who came in and saved the day. If you think of Snow White, sort of the same situation. He comes in, saves the day. If you think of Cinderella, it was the prince who came in and like gave her approval, her validation, what have you. But with these modern horror movies, even with the sci-fi stuff like Ripley from the Aliens movies, we have this idea of the final girl, and she's her own hero. She doesn't wait for the lumberjack to come in and kill the wolf in grandma's clothing. She doesn't wait for any of that. She's smart, she's savvy, and she's fighting for herself and her community. I love that. I love that. And I think about the things that I deal with on the inside. We all deal with stuff on the inside, emotionally, spiritually, mentally. We all have better days than not. And we all deal with monsters, right? The Freddy Krueger trope is great because he's kind of like on the inside. You go to sleep, everybody has to sleep, and he's on the inside. It's not like Michael Myers or the alien that's scary and it's outside. And if you get yourself to safety, you can be safe. This is from the inside. It's hard to run from the stuff that's on the inside, right? And the stuff that we contend with on the inside, the pains and the traumas and the griefs, and then those programs that tell us that we're lesser than or convince us that we're not beautiful or not great, those things are our biggest monsters. Yeah. And now think about the final girl that you can be in your own story. I just sat with a woman who is walking through a horrendous life. And one of the things that I asked her was, if you knew your daughter was going through a life like this, what would you do? She's like, I'd burn the town down to make sure that she wasn't suffering. I'm like, why aren't you doing the same for you? Why aren't you fighting for yourself in the way that you would fight for people that you love? We all would have very few problems in our life if we encountered them and fought for them like we fight for the problems of the people that we love. And this includes the shitty things that we tell ourselves over and over and over and over. We have to pick up the sword. We have to fight for ourselves. We can get help from therapists and psychics and herbalists and pharmacies and all sorts of things, and yet none of those things are really going to work until we pick up the sword and fight for ourselves. So this is your encouragement to be your own final girl in the horror movie of your life. Whether it's a person on the outside of you, whether it is a job or a relationship or a health condition, I want you to think of yourself as your hero, and I want you to think of the thing that's holding you back as the monster. Maybe you can put your hands on it like an abusive husband, and maybe you can get away from the abusive husband. Maybe it's this gnawing sense of inadequacy and failure that's within you, or grief or trauma or whatever it is. Fight it like Nancy on A Nightmare on Elm Street. Fight it like Ripley in Aliens. Fight it like Laurie Strode in Halloween. So I want to keep these videos under 10 minutes. That's how horror movies saved my life. And I want to ask you, how can you, in this spooky, scary season, be your own final girl? Hope that helps. Go fight the fight.